My daughter told me not to come for Christmas. Her mother's new husband will be there, she said. We are trying to make him feel like family. So I spent Christmas Eve my own way. But just after midnight, my daughter called. Her voice was shaking. Dad, why are you on the news? I am Calvin, 66 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The phone rang at exactly 6 in the evening on a Tuesday. I remember the exact time because I was looking right at the brass pendulum of the grandfather clock on my living room wall. It was Megan. My daughter usually only called when she needed me to fix something she broke, or when she felt obligated out of a sense of misplaced guilt. I picked up the receiver expecting a rushed request for a holiday favor, or perhaps a brief, emotionless check on my health. Instead, her voice came through sharp, fast, and entirely devoid of warmth. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask about my day. She launched directly into the assault, stating that we needed to talk about Christmas Eve. Howard is hosting dinner at his penthouse this year, she continued, and we think it is best if you do not attend. The words hung in the cold air of my living room. Howard was Patricia's new husband. Patricia was my ex-wife. They had been married for 2 years, and in that time, Howard had made it his personal mission to erase any trace of my existence from my daughter's life. He was a wealthy real estate developer, a man who believed every relationship was a transaction, and every person had a price tag. I asked her why keeping my voice perfectly level. I refused to give her the satisfaction of hearing my pain. It is just going to be too awkward, Megan said, letting out a frustrated sigh as if I were a child failing to understand a basic concept. Howard feels uncomfortable with you around. We are trying to make him feel like part of the real family now. Plus, Seth is finalizing that massive investment deal with him for the new high-rise. Howard is putting millions into Seth's company. We cannot risk making the atmosphere tense. You understand, right? I understood perfectly. I was a liability. To Megan and Seth, I was just a broke, retired old man living in an aging suburban house. They believed the divorce 10 years ago had wiped me out completely. Patricia had taken the cash, the primary residence, and the vacation property. She left me with what she called my worthless piles of paper. I was discarded because I could not offer them anything of visible financial value. My presence at a luxury penthouse would be an embarrassing reminder of the past they desperately wanted to transcend. You are choosing your mother's new husband over your own father on Christmas, I stated clearly. I wanted her to hear the exact reality of her decision. Do not make this difficult, Dad, she snapped back. Seth needs this deal to go through. Howard expects perfection. Your whole worn-out, humble routine just does not fit the image we need to project. We will send you a gift card or something. Just stay home. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or demand the respect I was owed. Arguing with Megan when she had her mind set on a wealthy prize was like arguing with a brick wall. I simply said goodbye and placed the phone back on its cradle. The silence in my house was absolute. It was the kind of quiet that rings in your ears, heavy and suffocating. My own flesh and blood had just placed a dollar amount on my presence, and I had come up drastically short. They believed they held all the power. They believed I was helpless, irrelevant, and easily swept under the rug. They were wrong on every single count. The quiet living room offered no comfort, so I walked down the narrow hallway to my study. The floorboards creaked under my feet, and the wallpaper was peeling slightly at the edges. I kept it this way intentionally. The illusion of a struggling retiree was the best shield I had against the greedy hands of my ex-wife and her social circle. I locked the heavy oak door behind me and stepped over to the bookshelf. I pulled a specific volume forward, and a hidden panel slid open, revealing my private workspace. I sat down in the ergonomic chair and tapped the keyboard. 3 large monitors flickered to life, bathing the dark room in a cold blue glow. The screens displayed real-time stock portfolios, international wire transfers, and a sprawling network of corporate holdings. The numbers climbing across the top screen were massive figures that would have made Howard choke on his expensive wine. When Patricia dragged me through the divorce courts a decade ago, she hired vicious lawyers to strip me of all liquid assets. I gave them exactly what they asked for. But I kept my engineering patents. I had spent 30 years as a structural engineer designing load-bearing frameworks for skyscrapers. I held the sole rights to a specialized steel bracing technology that allowed high-rise buildings to withstand extreme seismic activity. Every major developer in the country paid me royalties to use that design. I was quietly earning more in a month than Seth's entire company made in a year. I kept my wealth hidden to protect Megan. I wanted her to build a life based on hard work, not inherited entitlement. I wanted her to value character over cash. Clearly, my silent lesson had failed spectacularly. She had married Seth, a man driven entirely by blind ambition and greed, and now they had sold me out for Howard's approval. My gaze shifted to a thick, rolled-up set of blueprints sitting on the edge of my desk. Seth had dropped them off 3 months ago. He tossed them onto my porch with a condescending smirk. It was the preliminary design for the Apex Tower, his company's flagship luxury residential project in the city center. Howard was the primary backer. "Just give it a spell check," old man Seth had said, laughing, as he walked back to his sports car. "Tell me if the drafting boys missed any commas. You have plenty of free time these days." He thought he was giving me busywork out of pity. He thought I was just an outdated draftsman who could look over the margins. He had absolutely no idea who I really was in the structural engineering community. Until this evening, I had ignored the blueprints. I had planned to glance at them eventually. But being uninvited to Christmas, being treated like a stain on their perfect, wealthy image changed my priorities. I unrolled the massive sheets of paper and pinned them down on my drafting table. If they wanted to play games with investments and corporate image, I was going to see exactly what kind of empire they were building. I picked up my reading glasses and my architectural scale. I started with the foundation plans and worked my way up the steel skeletal framework. Hours passed in absolute silence. The blue light from the monitors cast sharp shadows across my hands as I traced the structural load paths of the Apex Tower. At first, it looked like a standard luxury development. Glass exterior open concept floors, heavy amenities on the upper levels. But as I moved to the lateral bracing schematics, my pencil stopped. I checked the calculations. I ran the numbers again on my digital terminal. My heart began to pound, a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. The math was entirely wrong. It was not a simple drafting error. It was a deliberate, calculated downgrade. The blueprints specified a high-grade tensile steel for the primary load-bearing columns. But the attached materials manifest the document Seth had accidentally left rolled up inside the blueprints told a completely different story. They were substituting the required structural steel with a cheap substandard alloy imported through a shell company. I cross-referenced the weight of the upper-floor luxury additions, the rooftop pools and the marble interiors against the yield strength of the inferior steel. The result was catastrophic. The building would not just sway during a minor seismic event or high winds, it would fracture. The core columns would buckle under the sheer vertical pressure. Seth and Howard were building a 60-story coffin. I pulled up the financial projections Seth had included to brag about his profit margins. By substituting the steel, they were slashing the material costs by 40%. They were embezzling tens of millions of dollars from the construction budget directly into their own offshore accounts. They were willing to risk the lives of hundreds of future residents just to inflate their profit margins and fund their lavish lifestyles. The personal insult of being excluded from Christmas dinner vanished instantly. This was no longer about family pride or hurt feelings. This was a massive, lethal fraud. Seth was the lead developer. Howard was the financial backer and primary materials procurer. They were working together to commit corporate manslaughter for cash. I sat back in my chair staring at the damning evidence spread across my desk. They believed I was a useless old man who would blindly nod at their success. They handed the blueprint of their crime directly to the one man capable of dismantling it piece by piece. I did not call Megan to scream at her. I did not call Seth to demand an explanation. Giving them a warning would allow them to destroy the evidence and hide the money. I needed to strike with absolute precision. I picked up my phone and dialed a private number I had not used in 3 years. It belonged to Nolan. Decades ago, before he went to law school, he worked a summer job on one of my construction sites. I taught him how to read structures, how to find the weak points. Now, he was a ruthless federal prosecutor known for tearing apart white-collar criminal syndicates. The line clicked open on the second ring. Calvin Nolan's sharp voice came through. "It has been a while." "To what do I owe the pleasure? I need you to look at a structure, Nolan," I replied. My voice hard and cold. "Seth and Howard are building the Apex Tower. They are embezzling 40% of the steel budget and using substandard alloys. I have the internal manifests and the downgraded structural blueprints. It is a mass casualty event waiting to happen." I heard the immediate shift in Nolan's breathing. He recognized the gravity of the situation instantly. "You have the hard proof in your hands right now?" he asked. "I have everything," I confirmed. "They handed it to me because they thought I was too old and broke to understand what I was looking at." "Do not let those documents out of your sight, Calvin. I am assembling a strike team. We need to follow the money trail before they pour the concrete." I hung up the phone. The war had escalated beyond anything Megan or Seth could comprehend. They wanted a perfect, wealthy Christmas without the embarrassment of an old man bringing them down. I was going to give them a holiday they would never, ever forget. I watched the sun rise over the suburban rooftops through the slats of my study blinds. The neighborhood outside was peaceful and totally unaware of the corporate slaughter I was about to orchestrate. My coffee had gone cold hours ago, but I did not need caffeine. The sheer audacity of the crime unfolding on my monitors provided all the adrenaline I required. Nolan was mobilizing his federal task force on his end, but government bureaucracy moves at its own methodical pace. I could not afford to wait. Seth and Howard were preparing to pour the foundation for the Apex Tower in a matter of weeks. Once that substandard steel was buried in concrete, proving the fraud would require tearing the entire building down. I needed to trace the money right now and sever their supply line permanently. I turned my attention back to the materials manifest Seth had carelessly discarded on my porch. The primary steel provider was listed as an entity called Summit Core Fabrication. On paper, it looked perfectly legitimate. It had a sleek corporate website, an address in a prestigious financial district, and a portfolio of impressive marketing materials. But 30 years in structural engineering teaches you how to recognize a phantom operation. Real steel fabrication leaves a massive physical footprint. It requires blast furnaces, freight contracts, heavy logistics, and a legion of union workers. Summit Core Fabrication had none of those things. It was a ghost. I opened a secure encrypted channel and began reaching out to my old network. Decades ago, long before Diane decided a modest life was a failed life, I spent half my year traveling the globe. I negotiated supply lines, inspected foundries, and built relationships with the most powerful logistics directors in the maritime shipping industry. My family thought I was just a tired old man attending boring conferences. They never realized I commanded the absolute respect of the international steel trade. I sent a single message to a former colleague who managed freight routing in Rotterdam. I asked him to run the import codes stamped on the bottom of Seth's manifest. The reply came back within 20 minutes. The information was devastating. Summit Core Fabrication was a shell company. It produced absolutely nothing. The steel arriving at Seth's construction site was not domestic high-grade material. It was being imported from a defunct scrapyard overseas. It was an extremely brittle low-grade alloy typically used for temporary scaffolding, not a 60-story residential high-rise. Howard had set up the shell company to to purchase scrap metal for pennies on the dollar. He was then selling that same scrap to Seth's development project at premium market prices. Seth, as the lead developer, was signing off on fake safety inspections, intentionally blinding the city regulators to the truth. They were pocketing millions in the margin, funneling the stolen budget straight into their personal offshore accounts. They were paying for their luxury cars, their penthouse suites, and their lavish holiday dinners with blood money. They were perfectly willing to let hundreds of innocent families move into a towering death trap just to elevate their social status. I forwarded the shipping logs and the offshore banking routes directly to Nolan. The financial trail was airtight. It linked Howard's holding company directly to the fake steel supplier and traced the kickbacks straight into Seth's personal trust. Any competent federal judge would look at those documents and immediately issue warrants for massive fraud and criminal conspiracy. But as I stared at the structural diagrams on my screen, something else caught my attention. A detail so subtle and arrogant, it made the blood freeze in my veins. I enlarged the digital blueprints, focusing closely on the lateral bracing joints holding the core elevator shaft together. The math had already proven the steel would snap under pressure, but the architectural design of the joints themselves was incredibly complex. The specific angle of the load distribution, the unique interlocking mechanism designed to absorb kinetic shock, it all looked profoundly familiar. I pulled up my own secure patent vault on a separate monitor and placed the two files side by side. My breath caught in my throat. Seth and Howard were not just building a fraudulent tower. They were using my exact patented seismic damping design to do it. I had spent 12 years developing that specific interlocking joint. It was the crowning achievement of my engineering career. It was the precise technology that generated the silent fortune my family knew nothing about. Seth had copied my proprietary blueprints line for line. He had stolen my intellectual property and integrated it into his death trap. He clearly believed that my superior design would somehow magically compensate for the inferior brittle steel he was buying from Howard. He thought he could steal my genius to cover up his greed. The sheer disrespect of the act was staggering. Seth had sat at my dining table. He had eaten my food. He had smiled in my face while secretly plotting to lock me out of my daughter's life. And all the while he was quietly copying my life's work to facilitate a mass casualty crime. Howard, the man who had replaced me in my ex-wife's bed, the man who threw his wealth around to make me look like a failure, was entirely dependent on my intellect to build his fraudulent empire. They thought I was a broken-down retiree who could safely be ignored. They had no idea they had just handed the architect of their stolen technology the exact weapon needed to dismantle them. I printed the side-by-side comparisons and sealed them in a folder. This was no longer just a federal investigation into financial crimes. It was a direct, personal war. They had infringed on my patents. That meant I did not just have to wait for the authorities to act. I had the legal right to completely paralyze their operations myself. Nolan called me back as I was organizing the files. He confirmed receipt of the shipping logs and the financial transfers. He sounded deeply impressed. He told me he had enough evidence to secure search warrants for Howard's corporate offices and Seth's development firm. He warned me that federal judges move carefully during the holidays, but he promised the raid would be authorized within 48 hours. He told me to stay quiet and let the authorities handle the rest. I thanked him for his speed, but I knew I could not simply sit back and wait for a raid. Search warrants would freeze their paperwork, but I needed to freeze their actual capability to move money. Howard was a cunning man. The moment he smelled a federal investigation, he would liquidate his assets, dump the shell companies, and flee the jurisdiction, leaving Seth to take the entire fall. I could not let him escape. I needed to trap him in a financial vice so tight he would not be able to breathe. I hung up the phone and opened a direct portal to my primary wealth management firm. The law could put them in prison eventually, but I could bankrupt them today. I looked at the corporate structure of the shell company Howard was using to buy the scrap steel. He had financed the massive purchase through a series of high-interest corporate bonds, assuming he could pay them off once the tower's initial residential units were pre-sold. He was highly over-leveraged. He was standing on a very thin wire of debt. I reached for my keyboard. I was going to buy that wire, and then I was going to cut it. Federal investigations take time. Nolan had promised a swift raid based on the evidence I provided, but I knew exactly how the justice system operated during the holiday season. Judges were on vacation. Warrants required multiple levels of bureaucratic approval. The gears of justice ground forward at an agonizingly slow pace. A man like Howard did not build a fraudulent empire by being slow or stupid. The moment he caught even a whisper of a federal inquiry, he would initiate his contingency protocols. Men of his caliber always had an escape hatch prepared for the day. Their lies finally caught up with them. I knew he would wire the embezzled funds to offshore accounts completely beyond the reach of American jurisdiction. He would liquidate his domestic holdings, pack his tailored suits, and board a private charter to a country without an extradition treaty. Most disgustingly, he would gladly leave Seth behind to take the full force of the federal indictment. Seth was arrogant and greedy, but he was also incredibly naive. He was the perfect fall guy for a seasoned criminal. If Howard escaped, Seth would face 20 years in a federal penitentiary for the structural fraud, and my daughter Megan would be left entirely destitute. She would be burdened by the massive debts and the public humiliation of her husband's crimes. I could not allow Howard to sacrifice them and walk away clean. I needed to build an inescapable cage around him. A legal investigation would eventually freeze his assets, but I needed to paralyze him right now. I needed to cut off his financial oxygen before he even realized he was suffocating. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line to my primary wealth management firm in New York. The man who answered was Philip, a senior portfolio director, who had quietly managed my patent royalties for over 2 decades. Philip was one of the very few people on Earth who knew the true extent of my liquid capital. For years, my instructions to him had been simple and highly conservative. I always told him to reinvest the dividends, maintain a low-risk profile, and keep my name completely out of the public eye. When he heard my voice on the line that evening, he greeted me with his usual calm professionalism, likely expecting another routine inquiry about municipal bonds or tax shelters. I told Philip we were shifting our entire strategy immediately. I instructed him to establish an anonymous blind trust under a generic corporate designation. I told him I required absolute secrecy and rapid execution. Philip shifted his tone from relaxed to highly alert. He knew I had never made a demand like this before. I transmitted the corporate identification numbers for Summit Core Fabrication, the phantom company Howard was using to import the scrap steel. I told Philip I wanted to know exactly how Howard had financed the initial purchase of those materials. Shell companies require massive seed capital, and I knew Howard was far too greedy to use his own liquid cash to fund a fraudulent operation. It took Philip and his team of analysts less than an hour to map out the financial architecture of Howard U.S. Company. The structure was a towering house of cards, built entirely on leveraged debt and extraordinary arrogance. To fund the massive importation of the substandard steel, Howard had taken out a series of high-yield short-term corporate bonds. He had borrowed millions of dollars from a consortium of aggressive private equity lenders. To secure those massive loans, Howard had used his own personal assets as collateral. He had leveraged his luxury real estate portfolio, his investment accounts, and the very penthouse where Megan was currently planning her lavish Christmas Eve dinner. Howard was operating under the dangerous assumption that once the steel was delivered to the Apex Tower site, Seth would blindly authorize the massive construction draw from the Project U.S. primary investors. Howard would then use that incoming capital to pay off the high-interest bonds, pocketing tens of millions in pure illicit profit. It was a classic financial float, depending entirely on perfect timing and absolute deception. But his entire foundation rested on those promissory notes currently held by the private equity firm. I instructed Philip to contact the firm immediately. I told him I wanted to purchase all of Howard U.S. debt. Philip hesitated for only a fraction of a second, before setting the heavy financial gears in motion. In the world of high finance, cash is the absolute king. The private equity lenders holding Howard U.S. notes were taking a significant risk, relying entirely on a construction project to reach completion without any delays or inspections catching the fraud. When Philip offered to buy the debt outright in cash for a 5% premium, above the current market value, the lenders did not ask any questions. They saw a rare opportunity to guarantee a massive instant profit without any of the associated risk. They drafted the transfer agreements within the hour. Sitting in my quiet, softly lit study, I watched the transactions process across my computer monitors in real time. My hidden wealth, accumulated through decades of honest engineering and careful saving, flowed seamlessly through the encrypted channels of the global banking system. I authorized the transfer of millions of dollars from my secure accounts into the newly formed blind trust. From there, the massive funds moved directly into the private equity firm U.S. holding accounts. In exchange, the digital contracts assigning total ownership of Howard U.S. corporate bonds populated in my secure server. I read over the fine print of the promissory notes with intense satisfaction. The stipulations were utterly ruthless, designed by lenders who wanted absolute control over their borrowers. Because Howard had used his personal assets as collateral, the holder of the debt possessed the immediate legal right to freeze his accounts and seize his properties the very second the bonds fell into default, or if any fraudulent activity was suspected. Until this precise moment, Howard believed he was completely untouchable, insulated by his wealth and his intimidating social reputation. He had absolutely no idea that his entire existence had just been purchased by the very man he had barred from his holiday table. The profound silence of my suburban home felt entirely different now. It was no longer the sad silence of a discarded father left behind by his ambitious daughter. It was the absolute focused silence of a hunter watching a trap snap permanently shut. By executing this acquisition, I had effectively become Howard U.S. supreme creditor. I owned the notes on his Phantom Steel Company. I owned the leverage over his luxury cars. I held the deed to the penthouse where he slept. I controlled the financial lifeblood of his entire corrupt operation. If Nolanus federal agents arrived and Howard attempted to run, he would find his credit cards completely declined and his bank accounts hopelessly locked. If he tried to hastily sell his properties to post bail or hire defense attorneys, he would find heavy legal liens placed against every single square inch of his real estate. He was financially paralyzed, pinned to the ground by the crushing weight of his own overwhelming greed. He had built his entire empire by exploiting others and cutting corners, but he had never calculated the massive risk of encountering a structural engineer who knew exactly which support beams to pull to bring the whole building crashing down. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and removed my reading glasses, rubbing the bridge of my tired nose. Outside my window, a light snow had begun to fall, dusting the quiet suburban streets in a pristine layer of white. The neighborhood was fast asleep, dreaming of peaceful holiday mornings and warm family gatherings. Inside my study, the glowing blue light of the monitors illuminated a perfectly completed puzzle. The physical evidence of the structural fraud was securely in the hands of the federal prosecutor. The financial chains binding Howard to his crimes were locked firmly in my possession. My daughter had uninvited me because I did not fit the wealthy, powerful image she desperately wanted to project to her new social circle. She had actively chosen to align herself with a man who dealt exclusively in illusions, manipulation, and theft. Tomorrow evening, when the clock struck midnight and the federal authorities descended upon their perfect, pristine celebration, they would finally understand the true devastating cost of their arrogance. They had invited a massive catastrophe right to their front door, and because of my silent adjustments in the dark, they had absolutely nowhere left to run. The digital ink on the transfer agreements assigning Howard us massive debts to my private trust had barely dried when my phone buzzed against the mahogany surface of my desk. The sudden vibration shattered the intense, focused quiet of my study. I glanced at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed Megan U.S. name, For a brief, foolish fraction of a second, a deeply buried paternal part of my heart hoped she was reaching out to apologize. I thought perhaps the quiet spirit of the holiday had finally pierced the thick wall of entitlement she had built around herself. I was entirely wrong. It was not a phone call. It was a relentless barrage of text messages and high-resolution photographs. The first image she sent was a panoramic shot of Howard O.'s penthouse. Massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping, arrogant view of the glittering city skyline. Crystal chandeliers hung over a sprawling dining table draped in pristine white silk and covered in silver platters. The second photograph showed Howard himself wearing a bespoke velvet tuxedo, pouring an absurdly expensive vintage champagne into a towering pyramid of crystal glasses. But it was the third photograph that carried the true venomous intent of the message. It was a picture of Seth. He was standing in an underground climate-controlled parking garage. He was leaning casually against the hood of a brand-new jet-black Italian sports car. A massive red velvet bow sat on the roof of the vehicle. The text beneath the photo read, "Howard really knows how to treat his true family." He just surprised Seth with an early Christmas bonus for all his hard work on the Apex Tower. "We thought about sending a car to pick you up, but Howard said you would just feel totally out of place around his corporate partners. Wish you could be here to see all of this. It is going to be a perfect night." She was not sharing her joy. She was deliberately weaponizing her luxury. She wanted me to feel small. She wanted me to sit in my quiet, modest home and drown in the bitter realization that I had been completely replaced by a man who could afford to casually hand out sports cars. She wanted me to feel the crushing weight of my supposed failure as a father and a provider. She wanted me to know that my empty chair at their table was not a loss to them, but a massive upgrade. 10 years ago, a message like that would have completely broken me. I would have called her, my voice thick with betrayal and hurt, demanding to know why she was intentionally twisting the knife. I would have given her the exact emotional reaction she craved. But tonight, I was not a discarded father wallowing in self-pity. I was the architect of their impending destruction. I stared at the bright screen, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, calculating clarity. If they wanted to play games with imagery and perception, I would give them exactly the illusion they desired. I typed a response, slowly ensuring every single word was perfectly neutral and entirely devoid of conflict. I did not express anger. I did not mention Seth or Howard or the car. I simply wrote, "Merry Christmas to you all. Have a beautiful and safe evening." I pressed send. That short, polite message was the ultimate smokescreen. By refusing to engage in her petty psychological warfare, by offering a docile and defeated blessing, I handed Megan the absolute confirmation of her superiority. In her mind, my bland text was a white flag. It was the complete surrender of an irrelevant old man who had finally accepted his pathetic place at the bottom of the social hierarchy. My lack of resistance inflated their collective arrogance to a dangerous, blinding level. They believed they were invincible. They believed they had won the holiday, won the family, and won the future. Because of that blinding arrogance, they completely lowered their guard. They were so busy gloating and celebrating their stolen wealth that they failed to realize what they had just handed me. I transferred the high-resolution photographs from my phone directly to my secure desktop server. I opened the sophisticated image manipulation software I routinely used for examining microscopic structural stress fractures in steel beams. I was not looking at the expensive champagne or the ridiculous red bow on the sports car. I was looking at the background data. Megan had unwittingly provided me with the exact tactical intelligence the federal authorities desperately needed. Federal raids on ultra-luxury high-rises are notoriously difficult to execute cleanly. The buildings have private security forces, separate elevator banks, and reinforced steel doors. To catch a man like Howard before he could destroy digital evidence or flee to a private helipad, the authorities needed to know his exact location and schedule. I zoomed in on the first photograph of the penthouse. In the reflection of the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, I could clearly read the illuminated numbers of the digital thermostat and the private security control panel on the far wall. It gave me the exact floor and suite number of Howard U.S. residence, a detail that was fiercely protected by the building U.S. exclusive concierge service. I moved to the second photograph. Behind Howard, a smug face resting on a marble kitchen island, was a printed itinerary from the private catering company. I magnified the image, sharpened the text, and enhanced the contrast. The schedule outlined the entire flow of the evening. Appetizers at 8, dinner at 10. The main holiday toast and family gift exchange exactly at midnight. I finalized my search by zooming in on the picture of Seth in the garage. The parking space number was painted clearly in bright yellow on the concrete pillar directly behind the new sports car. It was an assigned private spot. Now the federal agents would not have to waste precious time searching the massive subterranean complex for Seth U.S. vehicles. They could secure his assets the very moment they breached the building perimeter. Megan had tried to send me a mocking postcard of her elite new life. Instead, she had hand-delivered a comprehensive, detailed tactical map of a criminal sanctuary. I picked up my phone and called Nolan. He answered immediately, the chaotic background noise of his office indicating that his federal task force was already working frantically through the holiday evening. I have the final coordinates, I told him, keeping my voice low and steady. Howard is hosting the primary celebration at his private residence, Suite 7400. They have a strict catered schedule. The entire group, including Seth, will be gathered in the main dining hall for a champagne toast exactly at midnight. The primary suspect vehicles are located in the sub-level 3 secure garage spaces 41 through 45. I heard Nolan typing rapidly on his end of the line. The precision of the information was exactly what his strike team required. "That is brilliant work," Calvin Nolan said, the sharp edge of anticipation clear in his voice. "We were trying to quietly secure the floor plans from the building management without tipping off Howard U.S. private security detail. You just handed us the keys to the castle. The arrest warrants have been signed by the federal magistrate. We are moving in tonight. We will breach the penthouse right as they raise their glasses." I thanked Nolan and ended the call. The heavy grandfather clock in my hallway chimed, signaling the passage of another hour. Outside, the winter night had grown completely dark. The city was settling into a quiet, festive peace, completely ignorant of the massive financial and legal earthquake that was about to rupture. I walked into my small, humble kitchen and poured myself a simple cup of black coffee. I did not need vintage champagne or a penthouse view to feel victorious. I had successfully purchased the chains that would permanently bind them, and my own daughter had cheerfully provided the locks. The smoke screen was fully deployed and functioning flawlessly. They were currently standing at the very peak of their fraudulent empire, toasting to their stolen wealth and their unassailable power. They were completely unaware that the foundation beneath their feet had already been utterly demolished. All that remained now was the spectacular fall. The digital clock on the wall of the federal building read 8 in the evening. Outside the reinforced glass windows, the city was a sprawling canvas of festive lights and holiday cheer. Families were gathering around, roaring fireplaces, exchanging gifts, and sharing warm meals. Miles away in a penthouse floating above the skyline, my daughter was likely clinking crystal glasses with the men who had deemed me entirely unworthy of their presence. Inside the windowless conference room where I sat, the atmosphere was brutally sterile. The air smelled of stale coffee, industrial floor cleaner, and the sharp metallic tang of impending justice. I sat at one end of the long mahogany table. Nolan sat across from me with his sleeves rolled up and his tie loosened. The holiday season did not exist in this room. Next to Nolan sat a man named Arthur Vance. Arthur was a veteran investigative journalist for a major national network. 2 decades ago, a high school gymnasium roof collapsed due to corner cutting by a corrupt municipal contractor. I had provided Arthur with the anonymous structural analysis he needed to put that contractor in prison for a very long time. We had not spoken since, but when I called him earlier this afternoon and told him I had a corporate massacre ready to be unboxed, He abandoned his own family dinner without a second thought. I placed my heavy leather briefcase on the table. The sharp click of the brass locks echoed loudly in the quiet room. I pulled out 3 thick, meticulously organized dossiers and slid them across the polished wood. Nolan took the red folder. Arthur took the black one. I kept the master file in front of me. I did not waste time with pleasantries or dramatic introductions. I instructed them to open to the first page. I watched Arthur adjust his reading glasses as he stared at the side-by-side structural blueprints. I explained the mechanics of the apex tower. I detailed the specific yield strength required for a 60-story residential building to withstand lateral wind forces and seismic shifts. Then I pointed to the materials manifest Seth had carelessly abandoned on my front porch. I broke down the chemical composition of the scrap steel Howard was importing through his shell company Summit Core Fabrication. I showed them the math. I explained that the substandard alloy would absolutely buckle under the sheer vertical pressure of the upper floor luxury amenities. They were building a vertical graveyard. Nolan flipped to the financial section of his dossier. I had provided him with the complete tracing of the embezzled funds. He followed the trail of millions of dollars flowing from the initial construction loans into the phantom supplier accounts, and finally into the offshore trusts controlled by Seth and Howard. He saw the exact profit margins they were illegally skimming. Nolan leaned back in his chair, rubbing his jaw. He had spent his entire career prosecuting white-collar criminals, but the sheer brazenness of this operation left him momentarily speechless. They were stealing 40% of the entire structural budget. Then I directed their attention to the final section of the dossier. I laid out the original patent schematics for the seismic damping joints. I placed Seth Aus's stolen architectural designs right next to them. I explained that I was the sole legal owner of that specific technology. Seth had copied my proprietary blueprints line for line, believing my superior engineering would somehow miraculously compensate for the brittle, cheap steel his father-in-law was providing. He had committed massive intellectual property theft to facilitate a mass casualty crime, and he had handed the evidence directly to the patent holder because he thought I was just a tired old man who could check his spelling. Arthur looked up from the documents. The journalist in him recognized the magnitude of the story instantly. This was not just a local corruption scandal. This was a national catastrophe intercepted just moments before execution. He asked me why I had waited until Christmas Eve to deliver this information. He wanted to know why I had not brought this to the authorities weeks ago when I first discovered the anomaly. I told him the truth. I explained that I had only scrutinized the blueprints after my daughter banned me from her holiday celebration to protect her husband, who has fragile corporate image. But more importantly, I explained the construction schedule. According to the internal timelines Seth had drafted, the massive concrete pour for the central elevator core of the apex tower was scheduled for the 26th of December. They were rushing the foundation work during the holiday weekend to avoid municipal inspectors. Once that inferior scrap steel was encased in thousands of tons of concrete, the physical evidence of their fraud would be buried permanently. Proving the crime later would require tearing the entire building down, a legal battle that Howard would tie up in the courts for a decade. We had a window of less than 36 hours to stop them. Nolan understood the exigent circumstances immediately. The holiday presented a massive bureaucratic hurdle. Federal courts were closed. Warrants typically required days of careful review. But the imminent destruction of evidence and the direct, undeniable threat to public safety provided Nolan with the legal ammunition he needed to bypass the standard channels. He pulled out his secured federal mobile phone and dialed a magistrate judge directly at his private residence. I sat in silence as Nolan paced the length of the conference room. He spoke in rapid, clipped sentences outlining the embezzlement, the patent theft, and the lethal structural downgrade. He transmitted the digital scans of the dossiers directly to the judge U.S. Secure Terminal. He emphasized that the primary suspects were currently gathered in a single location, celebrating their new wealth, and that any delay would allow them to transfer the remaining stolen funds beyond international borders. The tension in the room was absolute. Arthur began drafting his broadcast notes on a yellow legal pad, his pen moving furiously across the page. He was preparing to interrupt the scheduled network programming. He was going to expose Howard and Seth to the entire country, ensuring that no amount of wealth or political influence could ever shield them from the public fallout. Arthur asked me if I was prepared for the inevitable media storm that would surround my family. I told him I had already severed those ties. My loyalty belonged to the innocent lives that would have been lost in that tower, not to the greedy individuals who shared my last name. Nolan ended his phone call and turned back to face the table. His expression was grim and entirely resolute. The magistrate judge had reviewed the material evidence and recognized the immediate severe threat to life. The emergency arrest warrants were officially authorized. The signatures were digital, but their power was absolute. Nolan looked at his watch. It was approaching 10 o'clock. He told me his tactical teams were already staged in the city and would begin moving toward Howard U.S. penthouse within the hour. I stood up from the heavy oak table and fastened the brass locks on my briefcase. The execution phase of my silent adjustment was complete. The evidence was secured, the warrants were active, and the media broadcast was primed for launch. I had taken the profound disrespect my family had shown me and forged it into an inescapable legal and financial trap. They had wanted a perfect exclusive holiday far away from my modest existence. They were about to receive an uninvited group of heavily armed federal guests instead. I thanked Nolan and Arthur for their swift action. I walked out of the sterile conference room, leaving the federal agents to do their work, completely ready for the midnight shockwave that would permanently demolish my daughter, U.S. false empire. The winter air outside the federal building was sharp and unforgiving, but inside the luxury penthouse across the city, the temperature was perfectly controlled. I could picture the scene with absolute clarity. The mahogany clock in my own quiet hallway began its slow, methodical chime toward midnight. At that exact moment, miles away, Howard would be standing at the head of a massive dining table lifting a flute of vintage champagne. Seth would be sitting to his right, wearing the arrogant smirk of a man who believed he had just successfully stolen the world. Megan would be basking in the glow of the crystal chandeliers, completely convinced that her curated flawless holiday was the ultimate validation of her life choices. She had severed the dead branch of her family tree, and in her mind, the tree was finally ready to bloom. They were celebrating a victory built entirely on a foundation of sand, and the tide was already rushing in. In the background of their opulent dining room, a massive flat-screen television would be playing a holiday concert, providing a sophisticated soundtrack to their elite gathering. Howard demanded perfection in every detail, and the ambient noise of a symphony orchestra served as the perfect auditory wallpaper for his wealth. They were seconds away from midnight. They were seconds away from toasting to their mutual brilliance. Seth was likely preparing a speech about the Apex Tower, bragging about his profit margins and the upcoming concrete pour that would seal their fortune. He had no idea that the concrete pour would never happen. He had no idea that the very blueprints he had carelessly tossed onto my porch had already sealed his fate. The grandfather clock in my home struck its 12th and final note. Simultaneously across the city and across the entire national broadcasting network, the holiday symphony was abruptly severed. There was no gentle fade to a commercial break. There was only the harsh, jarring electronic tone of a breaking news alert. The sudden shift in audio would have immediately irritated Howard. I could imagine his heavy sigh of annoyance as he reached for the remote, intending to mute the television and proceed with his grand toast. But before his thumb could press the button, the image on the screen paralyzed him. The bright, festive colors of the holiday concert were replaced by a stark aerial photograph of the Apex Tower construction site. The bold red graphics flashing across the bottom third of the screen read "Massive Federal Indictment," followed quickly by Apex Tower executives targeted in fraud sting. The champagne flute in Seth's hand must have frozen halfway to his lips. The smugness would have drained from his face in a matter of seconds, replaced by a cold, suffocating dread. The news anchor, a veteran journalist with a voice that conveyed absolute authority, began to read the breaking bulletin. The anchor detailed the immediate suspension of the Apex Tower project due to a massive coordinated federal investigation into lethal structural fraud. The words echoed through the pristine penthouse, transforming the luxury suite into an echo chamber of impending doom. The broadcast did not deal in vague accusations. Nolan and Arthur had worked with surgical precision. The anchor laid out the entire criminal architecture for the nation to hear. The network broadcasted the name of Howard U.S. Phantom Shell Company, Summit Core Fabrication. They detailed the specific scheme, explaining how the developers were importing dangerously brittle scrap steel from overseas and billing the project investors for high-grade domestic materials. The anchor explained the catastrophic implications of the fraud, stating that the building would have suffered a total structural collapse under its own weight if the construction had proceeded. Seth and Howard were not painted as clever businessmen who had made a minor administrative error. They were publicly branded as ruthless criminals who were actively engineering a mass casualty event for personal profit. Howard's face would have turned the color of ash. The protective bubble of his immense wealth popped instantly. The shell company he thought was untraceable was currently the lead story on a national broadcast. The secret offshore accounts he used to funnel the stolen money were being openly discussed by legal analysts on live television. Seth would be looking around the room with wide, terrified eyes, realizing that his career, his freedom, and his entire life were evaporating before his eyes. Megan would be sitting frozen in her designer gown, her brain desperately failing to process the sudden violent collapse of her perfect world. But the true shockwave, the absolute psychological devastation, had not even hit them yet. The news anchor transitioned to the source of the investigation. The anchor stated that this unprecedented federal raid was only possible due to the courageous intervention of a key whistleblower. Megan and Seth probably expected to hear the name of a rival developer, a disgruntled former employee, or a highly paid corporate spy. They expected to face an enemy from their own cutthroat world of luxury real estate and dark money. Instead, the graphic on the screen shifted. A high-resolution professional portrait filled the frame. It was a photograph taken of me a decade ago during my induction into the National Academy of Engineering. My gaze was steady, my posture commanding. The anchor spoke my name. Vincent Pierce. But the anchor did not use the tone of pity or dismissal that my daughter had utilized just a few hours prior. My name was spoken with profound reverence. The broadcast introduced me not as a struggling retiree living in an aging suburban house, but as a titan of structural engineering. The anchor recited my actual credentials. The audience was informed that I was the sole patent holder of the advanced seismic damping technology that kept half the modern skyscrapers in the country standing upright. The news segment detailed my decades of silent, flawless work, my immense contributions to urban safety, and my status as a fiercely private, self-made billionaire. The anchor went on to explain the ultimate, fatal mistake the developers had made. They had not only attempted to build a lethal structure with scrap metal, but they had also brazenly stolen proprietary architectural designs to do it. The broadcast explicitly stated that the developers had handed their fraudulent blueprints directly to the very man who owned the patents they were infringing upon. They had unwittingly delivered their own confession directly to the architect of their doom. In that penthouse, the silence must have been absolute, broken only by the sound of shattered glass, as someone finally dropped a crystal flute onto the hardwood floor. Megan's mind would be entirely short-circuiting. The fragile narrative she had constructed to justify abandoning me was completely annihilated. She had convinced herself that I was a worthless, irrelevant relic of the past. She had traded my presence at Christmas for a man who bought cheap sports cars and wore velvet tuxedos. She had allowed her husband to treat me like an unpaid intern. Now staring at the television, she was forced to confront the horrifying reality of what she had actually done. The man she threw away was not a failure. He was a giant. He possessed a level of wealth, power, and intellect that made Howard and Seth look like petty thieves playing in a sandbox. I had not been living in a modest house because I was broke. I had been living there because I did not need to flaunt my success to validate my existence. I had shielded my fortune to protect her from the very greed that was currently destroying her life. Seth would be staring at the screen in pure, unadulterated terror. The old man he had mocked, the man he had tossed blueprints to with a condescending laugh, was the man who had just dismantled his entire life. Seth realized in that agonizing moment that I had seen every single flaw, every stolen angle, and every falsified number the second I unrolled his documents. He had handed a loaded gun to a master marksman and dared him to pull the trigger. Howard, the arrogant patriarch of this false family, would be completely paralyzed. The broadcast made it abundantly clear that the whistleblower had also tracked the financial leverage holding his shell company together. Howard knew the rules of the game better than anyone. He knew that if his crimes were public, his creditors would instantly call in his massive over-leveraged debts. He knew that everything he owned, including the penthouse they were currently standing in, was going to be seized. He had built his empire on the assumption that he was the smartest predator in the room. He had just learned on national television that he was nothing more than prey. The illusion was completely shattered. The arrogant laughter that had filled the penthouse just minutes ago was replaced by the deafening roar of absolute ruin. They had wanted a holiday free from my depressing presence. I had given them exactly what they asked for. I was not sitting at their table. I was dominating the airwaves, commanding the attention of the entire country, and ensuring that their perfect Christmas Eve would be the very last night they ever spent in luxury. As the news anchor continued to detail the severe federal charges and the decades of prison time the executives were facing, a new sound began to echo through the corridors of the luxury high-rise. It was faint at first, muffled by the thick, soundproof walls of the building, but it grew steadily louder, cutting through the shock and the panic inside Suite 7400. It was the heavy rhythmic thud of tactical boots marching down the hallway, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of federal agents preparing to breach the reinforced doors. The reality I had set in motion had finally arrived at their doorstep. The glowing screen of my monitor cast a pale light across the dark study. The news anchor continued to speak, her voice steady and professional, detailing the sheer scale of the fraud I had just exposed. I reached out and pressed the power button on the remote. The television screen faded to black, leaving the room in absolute heavy silence. The deed was done. The mechanism of justice had been triggered, and its gears were already grinding forward with unstoppable momentum. I leaned back in my chair and listened to the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. It was exactly 12:14 in the morning. Christmas had officially arrived. Then the silence shattered. My cellular phone began to vibrate violently against the polished wood of my desk. The harsh, mechanical buzzing demanded immediate attention. I did not need to look at the glowing screen to know who was calling. The timing was too precise. I let it ring for a few seconds, gathering my thoughts, fortifying the emotional walls I had spent the last several hours constructing. When I finally reached out and picked up the device, I saw Megan's name flashing in bright letters. Only a few hours ago, she had sent me a message dripping with condescension, flaunting her luxury, and dismissing my existence. I pressed the accept button and brought the receiver to my ear. I did not say hello. I simply waited. A wall of sheer, unadulterated chaos erupted through the small speaker. The pristine, curated elegance of Howard U.S. holiday party had completely evaporated. I heard the deafening shriek of sirens bleeding through the shattered remains of the penthouse windows. I heard the heavy rhythmic thud of tactical boots slamming against hardwood floors. Overlapping the sirens were the sharp, booming voices of federal agents barking authoritative commands. Get on the ground. Keep your hands where I can see them. Do not move. Beneath the cacophony of the raid, I heard the sound of a woman hyperventilating. It was a rapid, ragged gasping for air, the sound of someone whose reality had just violently collapsed. Dad Megan sobbed. The word was a choked, desperate plea. All the arrogance, all the practiced superiority she had wielded against me for years had vanished entirely. She sounded like a terrified child waking up from a nightmare. "Dad, what is happening? Why are you on the news?" I kept my voice perfectly level. I did not allow a single ounce of satisfaction or vindictiveness to bleed into my tone. I spoke with the calm, measured authority of an engineer, explaining a mathematical certainty. "You are experiencing the consequences of your husband's actions, Megan." No, she cried out, her voice pitching into a hysterical shriek. They broke the doors down. Men with rifles just broke through Howard U.S. custom doors. They threw Seth onto the floor. "They are putting handcuffs on him. Dad, you have to help us. They are taking Howard away. He is screaming at them, but they will not listen. Tell me this is a mistake. Tell me you did not do this." "Oh, Mom." I listened to the sound of zip ties ratcheting shut in the background. I heard Seth crying out, his voice high and thin, protesting that he was a legitimate businessman. The illusion he had sold to my daughter was being dismantled by men wearing tactical gear and federal badges. "It is not a mistake," I said quietly. Seth and Howard decided to play God with the lives of hundreds of innocent people. They altered the structural blueprints for the Apex Tower. They substituted critical load-bearing steel with cheap, brittle scrap metal to embezzle tens of millions of dollars. They built a towering death trap so they could afford the very penthouse you are standing in right now. "That is not true," Megan gasped, though the weakness in her voice betrayed her. "Seth would never do that. Howard is a respected developer. You are just jealous. You are just trying to ruin us because we did not invite you to dinner." The profound absurdity of her accusation solidified my resolve. Even now, watching her husband being dragged away by federal authorities, she clung desperately to the narrative that I was the villain. She refused to accept that the wealth she worshipped was entirely bathed in corruption. "I am not jealous of a thief," I replied, my words slicing through the chaos on the line. "And I did not ruin you. Seth ruined himself the moment he decided his profit margin was more valuable than human life. He copied my proprietary seismic designs. He stole my patents to cover up his lethal architectural downgrades. He thought I was just a broke, useless old man who would not recognize his own life's work. He was wrong. I handed the unedited blueprints and the offshore shipping manifests directly to the federal prosecutor. I gave them the exact location of Howard U.S. offshore accounts. The line went silent for a moment, save for the heavy breathing of my daughter and the distant shouting of the agents securing the perimeter. I could almost hear the gears turning in her mind as the devastating truth finally locked into place. The broadcast she had just watched on television was not a mistake. The billionaire whistleblower the news anchor had spoken about with such reverence was her own father. The man she had exiled from her life because he did not fit her wealthy aesthetic was the very man who had just orchestrated the complete demolition of her stolen empire. "You planned this," Egan whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of horror and realization. "You knew this was going to happen tonight. You sent me that text message wishing us a Merry Christmas while you were sitting there destroying my life." "I sent you that message because you needed to believe your illusion was secure," I answered truthfully. "You sent me photographs of Howard pouring expensive champagne. You sent me a picture of Seth posing with a sports car bought with blood money. You handed me the exact tactical coordinates the federal agents needed to execute a clean raid. You confirmed that every primary target was gathered in a single room. I did not destroy your life, Megan. I simply stopped a massacre. Please, Dad," she begged, her pride completely shattering. "Please call them off. You know people. You know the prosecutor. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Seth will give the money back. We will lose everything. They are freezing the bank accounts right now. Howard U.S. lawyers are saying all his assets are locked by a blind trust. We will have nothing. You have to fix this." The desperation in her voice was absolute. She was begging me to sweep a mass casualty crime under the rug so she could maintain her luxury wardrobe and her high society status. She was asking me to compromise my entire moral foundation to save a pair of arrogant criminals. I felt a profound, heavy sadness settle into my chest. I mourned the daughter I had once raised, the little girl who had known right from wrong. That girl was gone, replaced by a woman who valued a penthouse view over the lives of innocent families. "I cannot fix this, Megan," I stated, my voice dropping to a low, definitive register. Even if I possessed the power to stop a federal indictment, I would not use it. Seth and Howard built a house of cards on top of a graveyard. It was always going to collapse. I just made sure it fell on them instead of the people who were going to move into that tower. "You are a monster," she spat, her sorrow curdling into venomous anger. "You are my father, and you are letting them take my husband away. I will never forgive you for this. You are dead to me." I absorbed the blow without flinching. Her hatred was meaningless now. It was the desperate thrashing of a parasite that had just been separated from its host. She was lashing out because she had absolutely no leverage left. "You made your choice about who your family was long before tonight," I replied quietly. "You chose Howard. You chose Seth. You chose the illusion of wealth. Now you must live with the reality of how that wealth was acquired." I listened to the chaos in the background one final time. I heard an agent ordering Megan to step away from the phone and provide her identification. The pristine, perfect holiday she had curated was entirely in ashes. "I am protecting the city from criminals," I said, speaking my final words to the woman who used to be my daughter. "Enjoy your family dinner." I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button, cutting off the connection. The screen went dark, and the chaotic sounds of the raid vanished, returning my study to its profound, peaceful silence. I placed the phone face down on the mahogany desk. I did not feel any triumphant joy or cinematic glory. I felt the heavy, quiet exhaustion of a man who had just performed a necessary, brutal surgery. I had amputated a toxic limb from my life. It was painful, but it was the only way to survive. I walked over to the window and looked out at the falling snow. The city was safe. The Apex Tower would never claim a single life. I watched the winter wind sweep across the neighborhood, erasing the old tracks in the street, and leaving behind a smooth, untouched surface perfectly ready for a new beginning. The sun rose slowly over the snow-covered suburban streets, casting a brilliant, blinding light across the frost that clung to the window panes of my small wooden cabin. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of pine needles and freshly roasted coffee. It was Christmas morning. For decades, this particular day had been marked by a highly predictable routine of forced smiles, exchanging expensive gifts I did not want, and enduring the suffocating feeling of being an entirely unwanted guest in my own family. Today, however, the profound silence in my kitchen was an absolute sanctuary. I sat in my favorite armchair by the window, watching the steam rise from my ceramic mug, feeling a deep, unshakable sense of peace settling into my bones. The digital news feeds on my tablet confirmed the total success of the midnight raid. The Apex Tower project was officially dead. Howard and Seth were currently sitting in separate federal holding cells, denied bail, and stripped of their bespoke suits and their arrogance. The world was righting itself, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could finally breathe. The pristine silence of the holiday morning was violently ruptured by the sound of heavy tires skidding erratically across the icy gravel of my driveway. I looked through the frosted glass and saw a luxury black sedan, a vehicle usually driven by a private chauffeur, slam heavily into the snowbank near my front porch. The engine was cut off abruptly, followed immediately by the frantic, echoing sound of car doors slamming shut. I did not move from my chair. I simply took another slow, deliberate sip of my hot coffee. Heavy, urgent footsteps pounded against the wooden steps of my porch, and a second later my front door was thrown completely open without a single knock. The freezing winter wind rushed into the warm cabin, bringing with it the two women who had spent the last 10 years making me feel entirely invisible and worthless. It was my daughter Megan, and stepping into the cabin right behind her was Patricia. Patricia was my former wife. She was a woman who had abandoned our marriage 20 years ago because she had ultimately decided that a structural engineer working to ensure municipal safety did not possess the ruthless financial ambition she required to be happy. She had married into a wealthy family of corporate lawyers, and she had spent her life raising Megan to worship the exact same hollow idols of wealth status and public perception. Standing in my doorway on Christmas morning, however, they did not look like the elite, untouchable socialites they constantly pretended to be. They looked completely destroyed. Megan was still wearing the same designer silk gown from the night before, but the expensive fabric was severely wrinkled and stained with spilled champagne. Her immaculate makeup was smeared darkly across her pale, exhausted face, and she was trembling violently from the cold and the shock. Patricia wore a heavy mink coat thrown hastily over a silk nightgown, her perfectly styled hair now a chaotic, tangled mess. They looked like survivors of a shipwreck, dragging themselves onto the shore, completely stripped of their dignity and their pride. They did not offer a greeting. They did not acknowledge the holiday. Megan surged forward into my living room, kicking the front door shut behind her. Her eyes were wide with a manic, unhinged desperation. She immediately began to scream, her voice sharp and frantic in the quiet cabin, demanding that I pick up my phone and fix the nightmare I had created. She ordered me to call the federal prosecutor immediately and completely recant my whistleblower testimony. She insisted that I contact the authorities and claim my structural analysis was flawed, that I had made a terrible age-related mistake in my engineering calculations. She demanded that I march down to the federal courthouse right now, use the massive hidden fortune they now knew I possessed, and post the millions of dollars required to bail Seth out of his holding cell. She commanded me to release a public statement to the business press using my legendary reputation in the structural engineering world to vouch for Howard U.S. Construction Company and stop the catastrophic bleeding of their stock prices. She wanted me to lie to the entire world to save the men who had planned to build a vertical graveyard. When I remained completely silent, simply watching her panic from the comfort of my armchair, Patricia stepped forward to amplify the attack. Her face was twisted into a terrible mask of pure, venomous hatred. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest and unleashed a torrent of bitter, deeply personal accusations. She screamed that I was a pathetic, jealous old man who could not stand to see anyone else succeed. She claimed I had orchestrated this entire federal investigation out of sheer petty spite because I could not bear the reality that my daughter was living a life of luxury that I could never provide for her. Patricia accused me of being a bitter failure who desperately wanted to drag everyone down into my own miserable, lonely suburban existence. She shouted that I had intentionally waited until Christmas Eve to spring this trap just to maximize their humiliation. She yelled that I wanted to ruin the most important night of their lives, just to soothe my own bruised ego and punish them for leaving me off a dinner invitation list. She screamed that I was a monster, a treacherous and unforgiving father who would rather see his own family destroyed and his son-in-law sent to federal prison than admit that he was an irrelevant old man. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up to meet their intense physical aggression. I did not offer a single word of justification, defense, or apology. The strategy of an emotional manipulator relies entirely on active engagement. They feed on arguments. They draw their power from making their victims feel guilty, forcing them to become defensive, and making them desperate to explain their actions. I refused to give them a single drop of that power. I sat perfectly still, my posture relaxed, my breathing slow and completely measured. I watched them perform their hysteria with the cold, clinical detachment of a scientist observing a volatile chemical reaction safely behind thick glass. When my coffee cup was finally empty, I calmly stood up from my chair, walked past them as if they were entirely invisible, and stepped into the small kitchen to pour myself a second cup. The mundane, ordinary nature of my action seemed to drive them entirely insane. Megan followed me into the kitchen, her voice cracking painfully as she shifted her tactics from aggressive demands to pathetic, desperate pleading. She cried that I was ruining her future, that Seth was a good man, who had just made a minor administrative business error and that I was punishing her for simply wanting a beautiful, successful life. She sobbed openly, leaning heavily against my kitchen counter, begging me to remember that she was my little girl and that a father is supposed to protect his daughter no matter what she does. Patricia continued to hover in the doorway, hurling vicious insults about my character, my career, and my utter lack of human compassion. The small cabin echoed with their screaming, their weeping, and their endless, frantic torrent of demands. They filled the room with a chaotic storm of noise, throwing every emotional weapon they possessed directly at my chest. I let them scream. I let them exhaust their lungs and drain their tear ducts. I let them burn completely through their anger, their panic, and their manipulative, performative sorrow. I leaned against the kitchen sink, sipping my hot coffee, maintaining direct, unwavering eye contact with my daughter. Slowly, the terrible realization began to wash over them. Minutes passed, and my profound silence became significantly heavier and more oppressive than their noise. The screaming began to falter, breaking into jagged, breathless gasps. The frantic pacing stopped entirely. Megan wiped her wet face, her breath hitching painfully in her throat as she stared back at me. Patricia lowered her pointing finger, the venom dying instantly in her mouth. The cabin grew completely terrifyingly quiet, leaving only the sound of the winter wind rattling the window panes. They looked at me and they finally understood. They saw that there was absolutely no conflict in my eyes. There was no hesitation, no residual guilt, and no lingering parental weakness they could exploit to save themselves. They realized that my silence was not the silence of a man who was intimidated by their anger or moved by their dramatic tears. It was the absolute, immovable silence of a judge who had already delivered the final verdict and walked away from the bench. They finally understood that all their screaming, all their begging, and all their hateful accusations were bouncing off a solid wall of iron. I had not acted out of jealousy, and I was absolutely not going to save them from the consequences of their own monstrous greed. The man standing before them in the kitchen was completely immune to their existence. The sheer shock of my absolute indifference hit them much harder than the federal raid itself. It was the ultimate unbreakable boundary, and it signaled their total, devastating defeat. The profound silence in the cabin stretched into an unbearable eternity for the two women standing before me. I watched the frantic energy drain completely from my daughter's posture, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. They had come here expecting a battle. They had armed themselves with tears, accusations, and shrill demands, fully prepared to batter my defenses until I surrendered. Instead, they had crashed headlong into a fortress of absolute indifference. Patricia, my former wife, lowered her trembling hand. The venomous words she had prepared died in her throat as she looked into my eyes and found absolutely nothing she could manipulate. Megan leaned heavily against the edge of the kitchen counter, her breath hitching in a series of ragged, quiet gasps. The reality of their total powerlessness was finally settling over them like a heavy winter frost. When I was certain that their hysterical performance had entirely concluded, I turned my back on them. I walked slowly across the rustic wooden floor of my living room toward the heavy oak desk that sat beneath the large bay window. I did not speak a single word. The only sound in the room was the soft crackle of the logs burning in the stone fireplace and the measured tread of my boots. I reached into the bottom drawer of the desk and withdrew a thick, bound leather portfolio. It was heavy, weighted down with decades of careful planning, meticulous saving, and ultimate leverage. I carried the portfolio back to the center of the room and dropped it onto the solid wood coffee table. The heavy thud made Megan flinch physically. I gestured toward the leather-bound book, inviting them to look. For a long moment, neither woman moved. They simply stared at the portfolio as if it were a dormant explosive. Finally, curiosity and desperation overcame Patricia's paralysis. She stepped forward, her expensive mink coat rustling softly in the quiet cabin, and opened the heavy leather cover. I watched her eyes scan the first page. I watched her pupils dilate as her mind struggled to process the numbers printed on the crisp white bank statements. I had laid out a comprehensive summary of my liquid assets, my diversified investment portfolios, and the massive untaxable royalties generated by my global engineering patents. The figures printed on those pages were staggering. They completely eclipsed the flashy, heavily leveraged wealth that Howard and Seth desperately paraded before the world. Patricia turned the page, her hands beginning to shake violently. She saw the establishment of blind trusts, the acquisition of prime commercial real estate, and the massive reserves of capital I had quietly accumulated over the past 30 years. You are looking at the reality you always claimed I lacked, I told Patricia, my voice calm and perfectly steady. You left me 2 decades ago because you believed my dedication to structural integrity and municipal safety was a sign of pathetic weakness. You demanded a man who would shout his ambition from the rooftops, a man who would drown you in visible luxury. You convinced yourself and you convinced our daughter that I was a failure because I refused to play that hollow game. Patricia looked up from the documents, her face entirely drained of color. Her lips parted, but she could not form a single coherent word. The shock of realizing she had abandoned a fortune vastly superior to the one she currently worshipped had temporarily severed her ability to speak. I turned my attention to Megan. She was staring at the documents over her mother's shoulder, her eyes wide with a mixture of absolute confusion and profound betrayal. I addressed her directly, ensuring my tone conveyed no anger, only the deep lingering sorrow of a failed father. I kept this reality hidden from you intentionally, Megan. I explained, watching the tears well up in her exhausted eyes. When your mother left, I watched her infect you with the disease of entitlement. I saw you beginning to measure the worth of human beings by the labels on their clothing and the addresses of their homes. I knew that if you were aware of the wealth I possessed, you would never strive for anything of your own. You would become a parasite feeding on my success, while cultivating an arrogant superiority over anyone who had less. I wanted to give you the greatest gift a parent can provide. I wanted to give you the opportunity to build your own character, to understand the value of honest labor, and to learn that true wealth is measured in integrity, not in optics. I paused, letting the silence emphasize the tragedy of my next words. That grand experiment was a complete and miserable failure. I watched you choose Seth, a man who possessed no moral compass, simply because he could provide the shallow illusion of prestige. I watched you actively erase me from your life, because my honest, quiet existence was an embarrassment to your new social circle. You traded your soul for a seat at a table funded by stolen money and lethal structural fraud. Megan let out a sharp, painful sob. You lied to me, she cried, her voice cracking under the weight of her realization. You let me believe we were struggling. You let me worry about you. I did not lie, I corrected her smoothly. I simply lived a modest life. You assumed I was a failure because you adopted a corrupt definition of success. And because of that definition, you aligned yourself with criminals. Patricia suddenly found her voice. Her shock immediately transmuted into a greedy, desperate calculation. She slammed her hand down on the open portfolio. If you have all of this money, she demanded, her voice shrill and urgent, then you can fix this. You can hire the best defense attorneys in the country. You can pay Seth's bail. You can use your influence to settle the federal charges against Howard's company before they lose everything. I looked at my former wife, marveling at the sheer, unadulterated depth of her moral bankruptcy. Even now, staring at the evidence of a mass casualty crime, prevented at the last possible second, her only concern was preserving the financial status of her daughter's husband. She did not care about the innocent lives that would have been lost in the Apex Tower. She only cared about the money. I stepped forward and placed my hand over the leather portfolio. I slowly turned the heavy pages past the bank statements, past the patent royalties, and past the investment summaries. I stopped at the final section of the ledger. I spread a series of highly complex legal contracts and promissory notes across the table, sliding them directly toward Megan. I am not going to save Seth, and I am certainly not going to save Howard. I told them, my voice echoing with absolute final authority. You came here demanding that I use my reputation to protect Howard's company. You demanded that I use my money to save the luxury life you believe you deserve. But you have fundamentally misunderstood the situation you are in. I pointed to the top document on the table. Megan leaned forward, her eyes scanning the dense legal text. She saw Howard's signature at the bottom of the page. She saw the corporate designation of Summit Core Fabrication. In order to finance the massive importation of the fraudulent scrap steel, Howard required enormous sums of short-term capital. I explained, dictating the mechanics of their ruin with clinical precision. He took out high-yield corporate bonds from aggressive private equity lenders. To secure those massive loans, he leveraged every single personal and corporate asset he possessed. He put up the company accounts. He put up the luxury vehicles. He put up the deed to the very penthouse where you were drinking champagne last night. Megan slowly looked up from the document, her breathing shallow and rapid. Her mind was finally connecting the final devastating dots of the trap I had built. Yesterday evening, while you were sending me photographs, mocking my absence from your beautiful life, I contacted my wealth management firm. I continued my gaze locking onto my daughter's terrified eyes. I instructed them to form an anonymous blind trust. Through that trust, I purchased every single cent of Howard's debt. I bought the promissory notes in cash at a premium directly from his lenders. Patricia stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth as she realized the total, inescapable nature of the devastation. The federal government is going to prosecute Seth and Howard for fraud, embezzlement, and reckless endangerment. I stated, delivering the final crushing blow. The justice system will take away their freedom. But I hold the paper on their entire existence. The moment the federal raid commenced, Howard's bonds fell into immediate default. As his supreme creditor, I have already executed my legal right to seize the collateral. I own the corporate accounts you thought would save you. I own the sports car Seth was showing off in the garage. I hold the deed to the penthouse. The wealth you are so incredibly proud of, the luxury you used to justify cutting me out of your life, actually belongs entirely to me. Megan collapsed into the armchair I had vacated earlier. The fight drained out of her completely, leaving only a hollow, echoing despair. She covered her face with her hands and began to weep the deep, mournful sounds of a person who had just watched her entire universe burn to the ground by her own hand. Patricia stood frozen by the coffee table, her eyes darting frantically around the modest cabin as if she were trapped in a cage with no visible exit. There is nothing left for you to demand, and there is absolutely nothing left for you to negotiate, I said, closing the heavy leather ledger with a resounding final snap. You built your entire identity on the illusion of superiority and stolen wealth. That illusion is now over. I turned my back on their weeping and walked toward the front door. I pulled it open, allowing the bitter, freezing winter wind to sweep through the warm cabin once again. I looked back at the two women who had brought nothing but cruelty and superficiality into my home. The door is open, I told them, my voice completely devoid of any remaining emotion. It is time for you to leave my house. You have a very long, very difficult reality waiting for you outside. Megan slowly stood up from the chair, her body trembling with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. She did not look at me. She simply pulled her ruined designer coat tightly around her shoulders and walked out into the freezing snow. Patricia followed closely behind her, her head bowed in absolute silent defeat. I watched them trudge down the icy driveway toward their luxury car, a vehicle they no longer truly owned, stepping out into a world where their names were no longer synonymous with power, but with public disgrace. I closed the heavy wooden door behind them, securing the lock with a solid, satisfying click, and finally returned to the peaceful, quiet warmth of my Christmas morning. Formatted precisely, the equation of my life was finally balanced. The heavy leather portfolio rested on the coffee table like a gravestone marking the absolute death of their arrogance. The crushing weight of my financial dominion had completely paralyzed them, stripping away the last remaining shreds of their fabricated superiority. The dramatic transformation in their demeanor was immediate and pathetic to witness. The ferocious anger that had propelled them through my front door evaporated into thin air, replaced instantly by the suffocating panic of a predator that suddenly finds itself caught in a steel trap. They had come here to bully a weak, discarded old man into submission. Instead, they had collided with a fortress of wealth and power they could not even begin to comprehend. Megan was the first to pivot. The aggressive, shrieking socialite vanished, and in her place she summoned the desperate, weeping ghost of the little girl I had once raised. She collapsed onto the floor, her ruined designer gown pooling around her knees, and crawled forward until her trembling hands gripped the fabric of my trousers. She looked up at me through a thick veil of smeared mascara and genuine, terrified tears. Her voice dropped an entire octave, morphing into a fragile, trembling whisper designed specifically to manipulate a father-us protective instincts. She pleaded with me to remember the past. She brought up memories from 20 years ago, reminding me of how I used to carry her on my shoulders, how I promised I would always keep her safe from the monsters under her bed. She begged me to look at her not as the architect of her husband's destruction, but as her daddy. She cried that Seth was currently sitting in a freezing concrete holding cell, surrounded by real criminals. She sobbed that the federal agents had completely frozen all their personal accounts, leaving her with absolutely nothing but the clothes currently on her back. She begged me to open that leather portfolio and transfer just a fraction of my hidden wealth to secure Seth-us bail. She promised that if I just wrote the check, she would cancel the divorce from my life. She swore she would bring Seth here to apologize on his knees, and that we could finally be a real family again. She offered to sell her loyalty back to me for the price of her husband's freedom. Patricia immediately joined the chorus of pathetic submission. The woman who had spent 2 decades treating my existence as a humiliating joke now stepped forward with her hands clasped together in desperate supplication. The expensive mink coat slipped from her shoulders, landing in an unceremonious heap on the rustic floorboards. She completely abandoned her haughty, aristocratic posture. She begged me to show mercy, citing our shared history and the vows we had once taken. She pleaded that a scandal of this magnitude would utterly destroy her new family-US reputation in the city. She implored me to think of the public shame, the media circus, and the utter ruin of the social standing she had spent her entire life meticulously building. She told me I had proven my point, that I had won the battle, and that I could now graciously step in to save them all. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the 2 women weeping on my living room floor. I did not interrupt their frantic apologies or their desperate bargains. I allowed them to completely empty their lungs, letting their words echo and fade against the solid wooden walls of my cabin. I observed their tears with cold, clinical detachment. They were crying, but their tears were entirely selfish. They were not weeping out of remorse for the monstrous crimes Seth and Howard had committed. They were not shedding a single tear for the innocent families who would have been crushed to death inside the Apex Tower. They were crying exclusively for themselves. They were mourning the sudden death of their luxury, the loss of their penthouses, and the evaporation of their unlimited credit limits. When their sobs finally began to subside into exhausted, ragged gasps, I took a deliberate step backward, forcing Megan to release her grip on my clothing. The physical separation mirrored the absolute emotional severance I had already executed in my heart. "I am not going to write a check," I stated, my voice echoing through the quiet room with a terrifying, immovable calm. "I will not authorize a single cent from those accounts to post bail for your husband. I will not make a single phone call to the federal prosecutor on his behalf. Seth and Howard are going to remain exactly where they are, and they are going to face the absolute maximum penalty the justice system can deliver." Megan let out a sharp, breathless wail, clutching her chest, as if I had physically struck her. Patricia stared at me in wide-eyed horror, completely unable to process the reality that her emotional manipulation had failed so spectacularly. "You came into my home this morning and accused me of acting out of petty jealousy," I continued, addressing Patricia directly, my tone devoid of any lingering affection. You accused me of engineering this entire federal raid simply because I was bitter about being excluded from a holiday dinner. You honestly believed that my ego is so fragile and my worldview so small that I would destroy a corporation just to punish you for a social slight. You measure every single action by how it affects your personal status, and you project that shallow, empty morality onto everyone else. I turned my gaze downward, locking eyes with my weeping daughter. I did not dismantle Howard U.S. Empire because my feelings were hurt, Megan, I said, pronouncing each word with heavy, deliberate precision. I dismantled it because your husband and your father-in-law are mass murderers who simply had not yet finished building their weapon. Megan shook her head frantically in denial, but I refused to let her look away. They deliberately altered the chemical composition of the structural steel intended for a 60-story residential high-rise, I explained, forcing her to confront the brutal, ugly truth of her wealth. They substituted critical load-bearing materials with cheap, brittle scrap metal that would have completely buckled under the immense weight of the upper floors. They embezzled tens of millions of dollars from the construction budget, and they stole my proprietary engineering patents to create a fraudulent veneer of safety. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew the building would eventually collapse. They were entirely willing to bury hundreds of innocent men, women and children under thousands of tons of concrete and twisted metal, just so they could afford the sports cars, the velvet tuxedos, and the crystal chandeliers you were bragging about last night. The absolute horror of the reality finally breached the thick walls of Megan U.S. denial. She stopped shaking her head. The color drained completely from her face, leaving her looking hollow and entirely broken. She was finally realizing that her perfect life had been funded by the promise of a massacre. "You came here begging me to save your family," I said, my voice dropping to a low, sorrowful register. "But the truth is, my family died a long time ago. The little girl I carried on my shoulders would have been horrified by a man who trades human lives for profit. The woman kneeling on my floor right now is a complete stranger to me. You chose to blind yourself to their corruption because the corruption paid for your lifestyle. You chose your path, Megan. Now you must walk it to the very end." I raised my arm and pointed a steady, unwavering finger directly at the front door of the cabin. "Get out of my house," I commanded, stripping away the very last ounce of fatherly warmth I possessed. "I have nothing left to give you. Do not call me again. Do not come here again. You are entirely on your own." Patricia scrambled backward, grabbing her fallen mink coat from the floor. She did not say another word. The sheer, overwhelming force of my absolute rejection had terrified her into silence. She hurried toward the door, her hands shaking so violently she could barely turn the brass handle. Megan remained on the floor for a moment longer, staring up at me with eyes that finally recognized the permanent, unbridgeable chasm I had placed between us. The manipulative tether she had used to control my emotions for years had been cleanly and permanently severed. She slowly pushed herself up from the wooden floorboards, her shoulders slumped in total defeat. She turned and followed her mother out into the freezing, brilliant morning light, stepping out of the warmth of my sanctuary and into the devastating, frigid reality of her new life. I walked over to the heavy wooden door and pushed it shut, listening to the solid, permanent click of the deadbolt locking into place. Outside, the engine of their luxury sedan roared to life, its tires spinning frantically against the ice as they retreated back toward the city to face their absolute ruin. Inside the cabin, the profound, peaceful silence returned, wrapping around me like a heavy winter blanket. I walked back to my armchair by the window, picked up my ceramic mug, and took a long, quiet sip of my coffee. The past was finally buried, the debt was fully paid, and I was entirely free. The federal justice system moves with agonizing slowness for the innocent, but for the guilty, caught in the glaring spotlight of a national catastrophe, it operates with the terrifying speed of a falling guillotine. Howard and Seth had spent their entire careers believing that the law was merely a suggestion for the poor and a minor inconvenience for the wealthy. They believed their expensive corporate lawyers could drown any accusation in endless paperwork and procedural delays. They were completely unprepared for the overwhelming, suffocating weight of the evidence I had delivered to the authorities. There were no loopholes to exploit, and no technicalities to manipulate. The original blueprints, the shipping manifests, substandard scrap steel, and the direct offshore money transfers were irrefutable. When they were brought before the federal magistrate for their initial arraignment, the arrogance that had defined their existence was entirely eradicated. I watched the proceedings through the live television feed in the quiet comfort of my study. Howard looked significantly older. The bespoke velvet tuxedo had been replaced by a standard-issue detention uniform. His face, usually flushed with the intoxicating thrill of power, was gray and sagging. Seth stood beside him, physically trembling. The charismatic charm he used to navigate high society galas was completely useless in a sterile courtroom filled with federal prosecutors. The judge read the charges with a cold, mechanical precision that echoed through the silent room. Wire fraud, massive embezzlement, intellectual property theft, and reckless endangerment of public safety. The prosecution laid out the timeline of the Apex Tower construction, detailing exactly how close the city had come to a catastrophic mass casualty event. They presented the forged seismic damping patents. They showed the jury the structural analysis, proving the building would have collapsed under its own weight. When the defense attorneys attempted to request bail citing Howard U.S. deep ties to the community and his philanthropic history, the judge immediately denied the motion. The judge declared them an extreme flight risk and a direct danger to the public. They were ordered to remain in federal custody until the trial. The realization crashed over them in real time. They were looking at 30 to 40 years in a federal penitentiary. Their lives as free, powerful men were permanently over. They would spend the rest of their days surrounded by concrete and steel that they could not manipulate or exploit. The destruction of their corporate empire triggered an immediate, devastating chain reaction that completely engulfed my former wife. Patricia had spent the last 2 decades curating an image of aristocratic invulnerability. She had abandoned our modest life because she demanded a grand stage, and she believed she had secured her position at the absolute pinnacle of the social hierarchy. She believed she was entirely insulated from the consequences of Howard U.S. business practices. She was entirely wrong. Howard had built his entire fortune on a towering foundation of leveraged debt. To finance the importation of the fraudulent steel and maintain the illusion of infinite liquidity, he had used every single personal asset as collateral. When the federal authorities froze the corporate accounts, the massive private equity loans immediately defaulted. As the supreme creditor who had quietly purchased those specific promissory notes, I authorized the immediate foreclosure of the collateral properties. The bank representatives and federal marshals arrived at Patricia U.S. sprawling luxury mansion early on a Tuesday morning. The estate was a monument to her vanity, featuring manicured gardens, towering iron gates, and an endless array of imported marble. I received the detailed report of the eviction from my legal team. Patricia had answered the door in a state of absolute haughty outrage, demanding to know why heavily armed men were standing on her pristine driveway. She threatened to call the police. She threatened to ruin the careers of every person standing on her porch. She wielded her social status like a weapon, completely oblivious to the fact that she was holding an empty gun. The lead federal marshal simply handed her the foreclosure notice and informed her she had exactly 1 hour to vacate the premises. The reality of the document shattered her mind. She screamed that there had to be a mistake, that the house belonged to her, and that she was a respected member of elite society. But her name was not on the deed, and the money that had paid for the marble floors was currently sitting in a federal evidence locker. She was forced to stand on the freezing sidewalk, clutching a single designer handbag, watching as strange men systematically changed the locks on the heavy mahogany doors. The neighbors she had spent years trying to impress stood on their own manicured lawns, watching her public humiliation with thinly veiled satisfaction. The aristocratic facade she had carefully maintained for 20 years was violently ripped away, leaving her exposed as a participant in a monumental fraud. She had traded her integrity for a mansion, and now she had absolutely nothing left. While Patricia was being removed from her estate, my daughter Megan was waking up to a reality far more brutal than she could have ever anticipated. Megan had lived her entire adult life inside a protective bubble of unlimited capital. She had never known the sting of an unpaid bill or the panic of a declining bank balance. She treated money as an infinite resource that magically appeared to fund her desires. When she left my cabin on Christmas morning, she still clung to the delusion that she could somehow salvage her lifestyle. She believed she could simply leverage her social connections, and survive the storm. Her awakening began at an exclusive boutique hotel in the center of the city. After fleeing my home, she had checked into a luxury suite, assuming she could hide from the media circus and figure out a strategy. When she attempted to order an expensive breakfast from room service, the concierge politely informed her that her primary credit card had been declined. Annoyed and deeply insulted, Megan provided a second card, then a third. Every single piece of plastic in her wallet was systematically rejected. The federal government had cast a massive net over every account associated with Seth and Howard, freezing the assets pending the criminal investigation. Panic finally began to set in. Megan grabbed her cellular phone and started calling her friends. These were the wealthy, influential people she had chosen over her own father. These were the women she went to charity galas with, the women who praised her taste and attended her lavish parties. She called them desperately, looking for a place to stay, looking for a temporary loan, looking for any shred of solidarity. Every single call went directly to voicemail. In the ruthless, superficial world she had fought so hard to join, failure was a contagious disease. Her name was now synonymous with a national scandal and public endangerment. The socialites she considered her true family excised her from their lives with the exact same cold, calculating efficiency she had used when she abandoned me. By the afternoon, the hotel management requested that she vacate the suite due to a lack of valid payment. Megan found herself standing on a busy city street corner, holding a useless leather wallet and staring at a world she completely failed to understand. The winter wind bit through her thin designer coat, offering no comfort and no shelter. For the first time in her 30 years of life, she was forced to confront the absolute void of her own capabilities. She had no practical skills. She had never worked a job that was not handed to her by a wealthy relative. She did not know how to draft a resume, how to navigate a public transit system, or how to secure a basic apartment lease. Her entire existence had been a curated performance funded by stolen money and endless entitlement. Stripped of the fraudulent wealth that defined her, she was entirely helpless. She walked for hours through the freezing city, the brilliant lights of the storefronts mocking her sudden poverty. She looked at the ordinary people passing her on the sidewalk, people she had spent her life looking down upon, and realized with crushing clarity that every single one of them was infinitely more equipped to survive than she was. I sat in the quiet warmth of my study, reading the finalized legal briefings regarding the foreclosure and the frozen accounts. I felt a profound, heavy stillness in the room. There was no joy in witnessing the total collapse of the people I had once considered my family. There was only the solemn, undeniable satisfaction of a structural equation finally balancing itself out. They had built an elaborate, towering structure using the weakest, most corrupt materials available. They had ignored the fundamental laws of integrity, relying entirely on deception to hold their lives together. I had not caused their destruction. I had simply stepped out of the way and allowed gravity to do its inevitable work. The empire of lies was reduced to dust, and I remained standing firmly rooted in the quiet, unshakable truth I had lived by my entire life. 6 months had passed since the federal raid dismantled the Summit Core fabrication empire. The heavy winter snow had long since melted away, leaving behind the vibrant green foliage of early summer across my property. I had settled into a profound and quiet rhythm. The media circus surrounding the collapse of Howard U.S. Company had reached a fever pitch, but I remained entirely insulated in my cabin. I knew exactly where Megan was. I had not abandoned her to the wolves without keeping a distant and silent watch. She was no longer residing in a luxury penthouse overlooking the city skyline. She was renting a tiny studio apartment in a working-class neighborhood on the far industrial edge of the city. To pay her rent, she had been forced to take a job as a retail cashier at a massive discount home goods store. For a woman who had spent the last decade commanding household staff and swiping platinum credit cards without a single thought, the transition was a brutal and crushing collision with reality. I received occasional updates from my private investigator. He detailed her grueling 8-hour shifts standing on hard concrete floors. He described how she had to deal with irritated customers, scan heavy boxes, and count out pennies until her hands physically ached. She was learning the exact value of a single dollar the hard way. She was taking the public bus at dawn because she could no longer afford a personal vehicle. She was buying discounted groceries and learning how to stretch a minimum wage paycheck to cover her basic electricity and heating bills. The universe was forcibly extracting the arrogant poison from her soul. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when she finally appeared at my door. I was sitting on the porch watching the rain wash over the garden when I saw a rusted 10-year-old sedan pull into my driveway. It was a stark contrast to the black luxury vehicle she and her mother had crashed into the snowbank 6 months prior. The driver's side door opened with a loud metallic squeak. Megan stepped out into the light rain. The physical transformation was absolute. The expensive silk gowns and the flawless salon hair were entirely gone. She wore a faded blue uniform polo shirt and dark denim jeans. Her hair was pulled back into a simple, practical knot. Her face was completely devoid of makeup, revealing dark circles of profound exhaustion beneath her eyes. Her hands looked dry and overworked, the manicured nails replaced by chipped polish and minor cuts. She looked older, tired, and completely defeated. She walked up the wooden steps of my porch with a heavy, hesitant tread. She did not barge in. She stopped at the top of the stairs and looked at me. I did not stand up. I simply waited. "Dad," she said, her voice barely a whisper against the sound of the falling rain. "Can we talk?" I stood up, opened the front door, and gestured for her to enter. The cabin was warm and dry. I walked into the kitchen and poured 2 cups of black coffee. I handed one to her. She took the warm ceramic mug, wrapping her cold hands around it tightly, as if it were the only source of heat left in her entire world. She sat on the edge of the sofa, looking down at her worn sneakers. She did not ask for money. That was the first profound difference. She did not demand that I fix her life or complain about the terrible injustice of her situation. She took a deep, shaky breath and began to speak. She told me about the sheer terror of her new reality. She described the intense physical pain of standing at a cash register until her lower back felt like it was breaking in half. She talked about the total humiliation of serving women she used to invite to her charity galas. She explained how those wealthy women now looked right through her, as if she were a piece of the store furniture, completely invisible and irrelevant to their elevated existence. But then she shifted the focus from her physical exhaustion to her moral awakening. She looked up at me, her eyes filled with genuine, deep remorse. "You were right," she whispered, her voice cracking under the massive emotional weight. "You were right about Seth. You were right about Howard. And you were right about me." She explained how the federal trial was progressing. She had been forced to sit in the courtroom and listen to the prosecutors lay out the exact mathematical certainty of the Apex Tower collapse. She had seen the forged steel manifests and the diverted funds displayed on large monitors for the public to scrutinize. She had finally realized that the magnificent life she thought she had earned was entirely soaked in the blood of innocent people who had simply been lucky enough to avoid dying. She finally understood that her luxury was financed by a calculated corporate massacre. I was so blind, she cried, the tears finally spilling over her eyelashes and cutting clean paths down her tired face. I wanted the high status so badly that I ignored every single red flag. "I treated you like an absolute embarrassment because your quiet honesty made me feel intensely guilty about my own superficiality. I lost everything, Dad. I lost my husband to a federal prison sentence. I lost my high society friends. I lost my beautiful home. But the worst part is realizing I completely deserved to lose it all. I listened to her pour out her heart. I did not interrupt. I let the silence hang in the air after she finished speaking, allowing the heavy weight of her confession to settle permanently into the room. I felt a deep ache in my chest, a profound parental sorrow for the pain she was enduring, but I also recognized the absolute necessity of this pain. The fire she was currently walking through was the only thing capable of burning away the toxic entitlement that had poisoned her soul for a decade. "You did not come here to ask for a check," I stated, keeping my voice perfectly level and calm. "No," she replied quickly, shaking her head to emphasize the point. "I do not want your money. I just want to know if you can ever forgive me. I want to know if I still have a father in this world." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. I leaned forward, resting my arms on my knees, maintaining direct and unwavering eye contact. "Forgiveness is not a magical incantation," Megan, I explained carefully. "It is not a simple switch that can be flipped to erase the past. You spent 10 years treating me as a disposable inconvenience. You happily aligned yourself with men who viewed human life as a rounding error on a corporate balance sheet. You cannot simply cry, apologize, and expect the slate to be wiped entirely clean." She absorbed the severe blow without flinching, a clear sign that the retail cash register was successfully hardening her spirit. She was finally learning how to accept hard truths without collapsing into a dramatic tantrum. "I am not going to rescue you," I continued, setting the boundary in absolute stone. "I have the massive financial resources to buy you a new house, to pay off your accumulating debts, and to insulate you entirely from the harshness of the world. I will not do it. If I give you a single dollar, I will be robbing you of the education you are currently receiving. You are learning how to survive on your own merit. You are learning the actual human cost of an hour of hard labor. You are finally building a foundation of real character, and I absolutely refuse to interfere with that vital process." She nodded slowly, wiping her wet face with the back of her overworked hand. "I know," she said, her voice steadying, holding back the remaining tears. "I know you will not pay my way. I am working 40 hours a week. I am paying my own rent on time. I am eating cheap canned food. It is horrible, and I am terrified every single day of failing. But for the first time in my entire life, I know that the floor beneath my feet is real. I know that the meager dollars in my bank account were actually earned by my own sweat and not stolen from a construction budget." That powerful realization was the absolute turning point. The arrogant parasite that had invaded my daughter, Yu's mind, was finally dead. In its place, an exhausted but resilient human being was beginning to take shape. I looked at her tired face, her unstyled hair, and the simple blue uniform shirt. For the first time in a decade, I actually recognized my child. "You have a long and incredibly difficult road ahead of you," I told her, my voice softening, just a fraction, allowing a small measure of warmth to return to the room. "You are going to have to rebuild your entire existence from zero. You will have to constantly navigate public shame, crushing financial debt, and the daily grueling grind of basic survival. But you are finally walking in the right direction." I stood up and walked over to the kitchen to retrieve the glass coffee pot. I returned to the living room and poured a fresh measure of hot, dark coffee into her mug, filling it to the brim. "If you need a safe place to sit quietly on a Sunday afternoon," I said, looking down at her, "you may come here. If you need someone to listen to you complain about your aching feet or your terrible store manager, you may call me on the phone. I will gladly offer you my time, my attention, and my absolute honesty. I will never again offer you my wallet." Megan looked up at me and offered a weak, tentative smile. It was a fragile expression, but it was the most beautiful, genuine smile I had seen on her face since she was a little girl. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet, profound relief. "That is exactly what I need." The early summer morning brought a gentle, cool breeze that swept through the dense pine trees surrounding my wooden cabin. I sat in my favorite rocking chair on the front porch, the weathered wood creaking softly, in a steady, comforting rhythm. I held a large ceramic mug of hot chamomile tea between my hands, letting the soothing warmth seep into my skin and chase away the lingering morning chill. The air smelled of damp earth, blooming wildflowers, and fresh pine needles. It was a pure, uncomplicated scent that stood in stark contrast to the sterile, heavily perfumed atmospheres of the luxury penthouses I had forcefully dismantled. For the first time in an incredibly long time, my mind was entirely quiet. The constant gnawing anxiety that had plagued me for months, the heavy burden of keeping a catastrophic secret, was completely gone. I breathed in deeply, filling my lungs with the crisp mountain air, and felt an absolute unshakable serenity settle over my soul. Just inside the open living room window, my small television set was turned on. The volume was kept low enough not to disturb the natural symphony of the forest, but loud enough for me to hear the breaking news broadcast. Today was a historic day for the city. The screen displayed a live, high-definition aerial shot of the Apex Tower. It stood in the center of the downtown district, like a massive, glittering monument to human greed and corporate corruption. From the outside, the glass facade looked flawless, reflecting the morning sun with an arrogant brilliance. But I knew the truth. I knew exactly what lay beneath those polished windows. I knew the steel skeleton was frail, brittle, and inherently compromised. I knew that the entire structure was a lethal trap waiting to collapse under its own monumental weight. The news anchor spoke with a solemn, reverent tone, detailing the unprecedented federal mandate that had led to this exact moment. Because the structural integrity of the tower had been fatally compromised by Howard and Seth utilizing substandard scrap metal, the city engineers had determined that the building could not be saved. It could not be retrofitted, and it could not be reinforced. The foundation was poisoned, and the core was utterly rotten. It had to be completely erased. I watched as the countdown began at the bottom of the screen. 10, 9, 8. I took a slow sip of my tea, feeling the warm liquid soothe my throat. 3, 2, 1. A series of rapid, bright flashes erupted from the base of the tower, followed immediately by thick plumes of gray dust shooting outward from the lower floors. The controlled demolition charges severed the main load-bearing columns simultaneously. For a fraction of a second, the massive skyscraper seemed to hang suspended in midair, defying gravity through sheer willpower. And then it simply surrendered. The apex tower folded inward upon itself, cascading downward in a terrifying, spectacular display of sheer kinetic energy. Floor after floor pancaked with a devastating rhythm, the brilliant glass shattering into millions of tiny, meaningless fragments. A massive, billowing cloud of pulverized concrete and steel rose high into the city sky, completely swallowing the surrounding blocks. The physical destruction of the building was an exact, literal mirror of what I had done to the corporate empire and the superficial reality my former family had worshipped. They had attempted to build an immense, imposing structure on a foundation of lies, theft, and absolute moral rot. As a structural engineer, I have known my entire life that the laws of physics are completely unforgiving. You cannot cheat a mathematical equation. You cannot negotiate with gravity, and you cannot bribe the wind. A building must transfer its load seamlessly into the earth. It must possess the tensile strength to withstand extreme pressure and unforeseen trauma. Human character operates on the exact same principles. Howard and Seth possessed no moral tensile strength. When the intense pressure of the federal investigation applied stress to their lives, their brittle, corrupt foundation immediately shattered. If a foundation is false, the eventual collapse is an absolute, unavoidable certainty. I had simply triggered the demolition before their building could claim the lives of innocent people. Watching the dust cloud slowly begin to settle on the television screen, I searched my heart for any lingering trace of vindictiveness or triumphant joy. I found absolutely none. I did not feel the petty, gloating satisfaction of a man who had successfully executed a personal revenge plot. The destruction of their wealth, the seizure of their sprawling estates, and the lengthy incarceration of my former son-in-law were not trophies to be celebrated. They were simply the tragic necessary consequences of cutting out a malignant tumor. I felt the deep, solemn relief of a surgeon who had successfully amputated a diseased limb to save the life of the patient. The people who would have moved into those luxury condominiums, the maintenance workers who would have walked those halls, the children who would have slept safely in their beds, they would never know my name. They would never know how incredibly close they came to a sudden violent death. And that anonymous, invisible salvation was the greatest reward I could ever possibly receive. My thoughts drifted away from the television screen and settled gently on my daughter. 6 months had passed since she had walked out of my cabin into the freezing snow, permanently stripped of her limitless credit cards, her designer wardrobe, and her utterly false sense of superiority. The transition from a pampered, arrogant socialite to a struggling retail cashier had been a brutal, crushing ordeal for her. I knew the transition had been agonizing. I knew she cried herself to sleep in her tiny, drafty studio apartment located in a forgotten industrial neighborhood. I knew her hands ached from standing at a register and scanning discounted merchandise for 8 grueling hours a day. I knew the humiliation of her new reality burned her pride every single morning when she was forced to take the crowded public bus to a job she used to consider beneath her dignity. But sitting on my porch, holding my warm mug, I felt a profound, swelling sense of paternal pride. When she had visited me last week wearing her faded blue uniform polo shirt and looking completely exhausted, I had finally seen the woman I had always hoped she would become. She had not come to demand money, and she had not come to hurl bitter accusations. She had come to confess, to apologize, and to seek genuine guidance. She had admitted that her ego had been crushed by the manual labor and the terrifying pressure of paying her own utility bills. She confessed that the physical pain in her feet and the numerical reality of her meager paycheck had finally opened her eyes to the grotesque nature of her former life. The arrogant, entitled parasite that had infected my daughter for 10 years had been completely starved to death. In its place, a resilient, honest human being was finally beginning to take root. By destroying her fraudulent fortune, I had not ruined her life. I had saved it. I had forced her to strip away the rotten, hollow framework of her existence and touch the solid, unforgiving ground of reality. She was finally learning the true heavy weight of a single dollar earned through honest, agonizing sweat. She was learning that human dignity does not come from the luxury label stitched into a handbag or the zip code of a penthouse apartment. She was learning that true dignity comes from the quiet, unglamorous satisfaction of surviving on your own merit and paying your own way without exploiting a single living soul. I had refused to give her a financial lifeline during that visit. I offered her a hot cup of coffee, a stern listening ear, and the absolute truth. I told her that she had to reconstruct her life entirely from scratch. She was building a new existence from absolute zero, but this time the foundation she was pouring was entirely real. It was being poured with the concrete of hard work and reinforced with the unbreakable steel of genuine integrity. She was enduring the stress test of poverty, and she was proving that she possessed the strength to survive it. She was finally becoming a person I could deeply respect. Patricia, conversely, had completely failed the stress test. My former wife was currently living in a cramped, rented room, spending her days writing bitter, venomous letters to former society friends who entirely ignored her existence. She refused to accept any personal responsibility for her downfall. She remained trapped in a perpetual cycle of victimhood, unable to comprehend that her worship of money had been the very mechanism of her destruction. She was trying to build a new life on the exact same rotten foundation of superficiality, and she would continually collapse under her own weight. I felt a fleeting moment of pity for her, but I quickly let it blow away in the mountain breeze. Some people simply refuse to learn the mechanics of a stable life. I looked back at the television screen inside the cabin window. The thick dust had finally cleared over the downtown district, revealing a massive empty crater where the monument to corporate greed had once stood. The news anchor was now reporting that the city had already selected a new highly reputable construction firm to clear the debris and begin rebuilding the site from the ground up. This time, the municipal inspectors would examine every single piece of graded steel. This time, the structural engineers would ensure the load-bearing columns were perfectly calibrated. This time, the building would stand tall, strong, and completely safe. It would be a magnificent structure capable of weathering any massive storm or seismic event because it was going to be built the right way. I smiled, a small, quiet expression of pure contentment. I raised my ceramic mug and took one final lingering sip of the warm tea. The forest around me hummed with the beautiful, ordinary sounds of life. The birds were singing in the high pine branches, and the wind was rustling gently through the green leaves. The past was entirely demolished. The toxic debris had been cleared away, and the ground beneath our feet was finally solid enough to support a beautiful, enduring future. The story demonstrates that true strength and character can never be purchased with stolen wealth or fabricated social status. A life built upon lies and the exploitation of others will inevitably collapse when subjected to the harsh pressures of reality. Genuine redemption requires accepting full accountability for our actions and enduring the painful, necessary process of rebuilding our lives through honest labor. Only by facing the severe consequences of our arrogance can we strip away superficial entitlement and discover the solid, unshakable foundation of personal integrity. What steps are you taking today to ensure your own life is built upon a foundation of absolute truth and integrity?